Rob Cross, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I'm thrilled to have you in this conversation with me, talking about your brilliant book, which I find on a daily basis, Rob. I have conversations with people talking about the overwhelm they're feeling and recommending your book, Beyond Collaboration Overload: How to Work Smarter, Get Ahead, and Restore Your Well Being, which is really important to all of us. But before we get to that, would love to know whereabouts you grew up and how your upbringing impacted who you became, Rob.
Thank you so much. What a great question to begin with. It's first of all, it's a privilege to be here and to be in a discussion with you and think about these ideas together. I think probably the most poignant thing about my upbringing is that there was no there. I was very frequently moved up and down the East Coast and learned very quickly about how to kind of embed into new relationships and connections, depending on the community I was put into. And so I think that process of kind of understanding, the impact of being able to form connections quickly and thriving, as a young and then high school age child was probably one of the more formative things that impacted my interest in what I started to study 24 years ago.
And you've been studying networks. That's very interesting. So you had to tap into new networks as you were going to these different cities. How were you able to do that as a kid before then ending up studying it?
One of the things that I learned early on intuitively and that we've seen play out in the data is actually, I call this a principle of push versus pull. So a lot of people, when they're new to groups, they try to come in and, the conventional wisdom, first 90 days wisdom is you go out and tell people what you do. You build your brand, put points on the board. And what we're finding is that that's actually not necessarily the thing that slingshots you into groups, right? Half the time people don't care what you've done unless they see how it fits with what they care about. And so this notion that we're seeing with people that move quickly into networks and get positioned well is they're more likely to go out, have a lot of initial meetings, ask a lot of questions, but then slowly morph what they know to the incumbent's needs, right? So they don't just immediately start with their background, they're positioning the expertise, then they're giving status, generating energy, and creating a mutual win. And they get pulled into these groups in about a third the time of people that are pushing, right? Just kind of saying, here's what I've done before. And I think intuitively, I figured that out as a child and rediscovered it, 30, 40 years later in some of the research that we're doing here.
That's really interesting, Rob. So it sounds like there are similarities with respect to sales, both as you were tapping into networks in new cities, new schools growing up, and also what you have seen in working with organizations and studying people that are able to sort of accelerate their engagement in the organization. They are not coming in talking, they are asking questions.
And it's a real simple inflection point. The natural tendency, anybody that's new to a group, is the incumbent person is going to say, tell me what you do, tell me about yourself. And we respond just naturally, right? It's not an arrogant thing. But what we found with these really fast movers, the people that kind of replicate the connectivity of a high performer in a third of the time, is they're more likely in that moment to just pivot the conversation slightly and say, well, I can, but can you tell me first a little bit about what are 2 or 3 things you're passionate about and what you're doing right now, and maybe 2 or 3 pain points you have. And whether that's a young person coming in and then slowly saying, okay, here's how I can fit in, how I can contribute, or it's a leader stepping in and trying to win the engagement of their team by removing pain points. That process we find is far more likely to kind of create inclusion, engagement, to pull people into work. And then you benefit also by virtue of you ride on the legitimacy of the established people, right? So then suddenly somebody that's very well known is going out and saying, well, you can trust Rob, he knows what he's doing. and you just get kind of drawn in far more rapidly. And unfortunately, we beat this out of people through schools too much, right? We teach them how to be smart in the moment in the classroom and, pithy and, really direct and to the point, and kind of miss this in the process of understanding kind of how people become valued in groups, right? And how they get drawn in.
That is one of those counterintuitive points that you make, Rob. As you said, both schooling and otherwise, we feel like when we're new, we need to present, we need to talk, we need to show. And in this instance, it's really important to ask those questions. Before going on more on the collaboration front, just curious, you've been studying networks and to a certain extent collaboration for a quarter century now. How has it changed over that time period?
Good question. And I think you're saying I'm old, right? With that, it shocks me every time I say 23, 24. Now it's 25 years out there. But yeah, I originally got interested in these ideas. I was actually focused in my doctoral work on trying to create technologies that more mimicked how the brain thought, and then help, with the knowledge management efforts to move expertise across lines. And what I found is everybody I would talk to about how they solved the problem at work, nobody ever mentioned the technologies. Everybody mentioned that I used my network to get expertise, decision approvals, I come up with a new idea, whatever it may be. And so that got me interested at that point in time in saying, well, if we could visualize these collaborations, actually analytically understanding who's interacting with whom in these large groups, then it's going to give leaders very different purchase on how they run their teams or their entire organizations overall. And what we've seen, one of the biggest things that led me to the work in Beyond Collaboration Overload was that from that point on, as we mapped these analytics in groups, sometimes 10,000, sometimes 50, sometimes 80,000 people, right, to understand kind of how work was actually happening in organizations, is that the intensity or the time spent in collaboration has done nothing but rise over the past 15, 20 years. And it started, with the movement to matrix-based designs, and then there was spans and layers efforts, and, more contemporary efforts around agile, in parallel with all of that. It's all these new technologies that sound good in theory, because we can instantaneously be in contact with each other. We can create seamless enterprises, one firm cultures. But you layer them on to a point now where most people are working across typically 8 to 9 collaborative applications to get their work done. You hear that and you're going, oh my gosh, that can't be. but you start adding it up, and it's email, it's Zoom, it's the Slack channel, it's the team collaborative space, it's the phone. And so what that has meant for us is that as we've tried to create these more nimble, adaptable organizations, we have had an unintended consequence of drowning people in collaborative efforts, right? So when I'm thinking about collaboration overload, I'm not at all saying don't collaborate. Everybody wants those, 8, 10 person team meetings where the ideas are flowing and it's happening. What I'm gearing on is the excessive demands that are created by the amount of time we spend on email meetings, IM, drifting earlier into the morning, deeper into the night, and that nobody's really got their hand around that, right? So that's been, by far one of the biggest things that has shifted over the years, just the volume, the intensity, the diversity of that churn of our lives has gone up pretty significantly.
It really has, Rob, and I even love the title of your book because collaboration is almost always seen as a positive, and there are positive elements of collaboration. With a lot of artificial intelligence and other factors, we need even more collaboration among us in organizations to be able to be productive and get things done. At the same time, there is an overload. You also talk about the fact that 85% of our time is spent on meetings, on email, and these other elements, which what I find in working with the organizations that I coach, people are working a lot, feeling anxiety and pressure, but not getting much done. So the attempts at collaboration are getting in the way of actually producing results.
Yeah, and that 85%, that was pre-pandemic. What we've seen through the pandemic is that number has gone up for many, many people about 5 to 8 hours a week. and it's drifting earlier into the morning and deeper into the night. And one of the, it would be comical if it weren't so tragic in a sense, but the biggest idea that most people had going through the pandemic is we're going to move from 1 hour meetings to 30-minute meetings so we can get more of them in. And so, you end the day not with 8 1-hour meetings that people were complaining about pre-pandemic, but 16 30-minute. And we're exhausted, right? Because you're more intense in those sessions, you're switching across the meetings more rapidly, and you end the day with a to-do list based on 16 meetings, not 8. And it's just not, it's not viable, right? It's because in many ways we're not looking at it and saying, what do we need out of collaboration, right? If we're trying to stimulate innovation, how do we get those connections in the right way? We're instead throwing the tools at it, right? And just saying, okay, Zoom calls are going to solve this, or other things like that. So I've seen the same thing. In fact, my next book is really on this idea of micro stresses and understanding kind of how stress is happening to people today in a fundamentally different way than we've ever seen before, because of the way it's coming at us through connections, not just because we're always on, but because the touch points that hit us through the day are coming through all these collaborations. And so it's even magnified if you're angry with somebody, right? Or if you love somebody and you're worried about it, right? It's not just the negative that create this. So it's a fascinating time, right? We have more ability probably than ever in our past to shape what we do and who we do it with, but it comes with, a phenomenal cost too that we have to manage as individuals.
So, Rob, I'm somewhat disappointed because I was expecting you to tell me a tech tool that now I can implement with the teams and organizations I work with that would address collaboration overload.
Yeah. I mean, that's what everybody wants, right? The one tool or the one simple trick.
That
What we see in this, to me, is that the people that do better, so you can imagine analytically, I would go out and I would map, who's collaborating in these massive analytics and identify who are the people that are giving the greatest impact, taking the least amount of time. And we interviewed the heck out of them, right? To understand, okay, what are you doing? And the key thing I learned is it's not one thing, right? It's not one technology. It's not one approach, that this is much more of a brawl than a ballet, right? That people are really, that are successful at this, they tend to hunker down and fight for the time on the margins. And that it's actually not the technologies that matter so much as the norms of use that are killing us. So for example, most people will look at email and say, well, I can't control all of email, so I'm not even going to try. What I would find with my efficient collaborators is that they would come in and say, well, my team generates 40% of what I have to do, and we can set some norms there. Right? One of the simplest, most elegant solutions I hear people use all the time is take a blank piece of paper and draw 2 lines down. So you got 3 columns. On the first column, indicate here's all the ways we're collaborating, right? Email, phone, meeting, whatever. And the second column, say here are 3 or 4 norms we want to start following, right? So we're not going to write emails that are 10 paragraphs or hiding what we want in the ninth, or we're going to use bullets or things like that. And then on the last column, for each of these modalities, say here are 3 or 4 things we're going to stop doing. Right? So we're going to stop sending email at 10 o'clock at night. You may have to do it then, but send it on a delay the next morning, so you're not starting an always on culture. It takes no more than an hour with a team to sit down in a team meeting and say, here's ways that we ought to think about how we're collaborating. And you get back significant portions of time, right? Not just for yourself, but for everybody involved. And so to me, that's kind of the trick. It's more the norms and how we're thinking about collaboration than it is the tool, even though there's always a desire. I wish I could find that tool you're talking about too. Out there.
And it's incredible, Rob. You found out that the 10% that are most effective at collaboration uh, get 18 to 24% of their time back. So that's almost a quarter of every week, more than a day a week back by approaching it differently.
Right. And that's the thing, right? That's the magic. And I was floored by it when I would first see this and these analytics, that what I call these efficient collaborators, they were producing greater outcomes. So they weren't not collaborating at the expense of performance. They're actually producing greater outcomes and enabling others to produce greater outcomes. And yet they were typically 18 to 24% more efficient. than their peers. And so it was a real eye opener, to say, okay, let's understand kind of how these people are doing. And it boils down, as you know, the book's kind of organized on an infinity loop, with the left side of the loop being, what are these people doing that are enabling them to buy back this time? And then the right side being, how do they spend it, which I think is just as important, right? Because if all we focus on is how to buy back time, then we're going to end back up in the same problem I just mentioned with the Zoom meetings, right? We'll go for, hour meetings to 30-minute meetings, and it never catches up. But the people that are doing it better, they are defined typically by how they're putting structure into their work differently, how they manage these identity triggers. And this really surprised me, was that 50% or more of overload I can see in this work now is self-generated. Right? I'd always assumed overload was external, emails, time zones, nasty bosses, and there's definitely an element of that. But I can also see that we're our own worst enemies far more often than we realize. And the more efficient collaborators are just better at seeing how they're doing that and stopping on that front. So they tend to manage structure, manage triggers that lead them to jump, and then tactically, they're just more efficient in kind of what they're doing day to day. So, but tremendous benefit, right, to kind of learn from that group and say, okay, how can I apply different aspects of this to how my life is unfolding?
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned, Rob, I was laughing when I read it, and every time I think about it, is that for many leaders, the servant leadership approach is part of the problem of
Right.
causing all this overwhelm.
Yeah, I mean, every time I look at my analytics and I go back into an organization and I say, like, here's 5% of your population that's overwhelmed, right? And if I'm looking at a 5,000 person group, right, that's a pretty significant number of people, and they're invisibly slowing things down. Half the time they're burning out, half the time the people around them are leaving at a higher rate. So there's a lot of implications of that. But the knee-jerk reaction every time somebody sees that is, well, you could finish the sentence, right? But I'll do it. It's they need to delegate. Right, they're control freaks, they're micromanaging. And I would say in only maybe 5 to 10% of the situations we see in the data is that what gets people into trouble, right? It's actually a whole set of other triggers that lead us to jump in. So the servant-based mindset, people that have a strong desire to help, helping is a great thing, but if you do it too quickly and in the wrong way, then you create yourself as a path of least resistance. And at some point today, there's nobody that can survive, right? All the demands that can come at you. And so it's a real kind of interesting conundrum to figure out, okay, what's that trigger, right? That leads you to jump in when you shouldn't, and then find ways to guard against it. So with the servant idea, it's not that helping is bad, but it needs to be helping in a way that builds capability, not just helping directly because it makes you feel good in that quick moment, right? You feel like you're showing you're a leader and you're helping in ways that creates kind of feedback back to you over time.
Just want to underline that point, Rob, that you mentioned, helping in a way that builds capability, because part of what you say is that just buying time back is not enough. And the way I think about it is at the beginning of the pandemic, most people got a couple of hours a day of commute time back. And that hasn't stopped the overwhelm. It just allowed for more meetings to be scheduled, more things to be done, and more things to fall behind on. So if we don't approach leadership and the way we collaborate with each other differently, it doesn't matter if we get hours and hours back, we will continue wasting those hours.
Yeah. I think that's, like, if I have one principle behind the book, it's to play offense, not defense. Right. The people that I see that allow themselves to get into trouble, and the stories I hear that can be quite heart-wrenching, ultimately it ties back to just trying to be too responsive to the system and not to kind of put, your own aspirations, efforts into play in unique ways. And one of the eye openers for me as we went into the pandemic, about 8 weeks in, I was asked by a whole bunch of these survey companies to say, can you include some network related questions right into our multi company surveys? And one of them I just put in there at the very end, they let me put it in, was just open-ended question, kind of tell me about your experience with COVID, right? Because we've never seen anything like this, right? The huge structural shift in how people are living their lives. And normally you do that in a survey, it can go out to 100,000 people and you probably get 3 pages of open-ended text back, right? They're just, nobody fills these things out. But in this case, we were getting hundreds of pages back and very deep, thoughtful answers. And what was fascinating is they would go in two completely different directions. So the first one I would read would be, thank the Lord I don't have my commute anymore, right? I'm talking to my significant other, my children like me, I'm exercising, eating, sleeping, whatever it may be. And thank goodness, right, that this has happened, right? And then the very next one would be equally impassioned. It'd be like, oh my gosh, where did my commute go, right? It was the only time I had to think. Now I'm, online constantly. I can't believe this. I've got to get back to the office, whatever it may be. But what hit me in that is that for that second group, it's not the commute, right? It's that they gave up control of the situation too quickly, right? They weren't clear, right, on kind of what was important to them, and they got overrun. And I think that's going to be a problem, it's even more important as we go forward. I mean, people would do silly things like use the train schedule to say, well, I've got to get out of the office. You know what I mean? Before. Now, suddenly we don't have that, right? Or all these little structures that we use. If we're not putting that into play, we're going to get overrun, right? And people are going to kind of fall into this posture if they're not more thoughtful, to your point.
Yeah, I think that structure really helps. Now, one of the concerns that I hear, Rob, is a consistent theme of it's my boss who is initiating this, or the CEO that starts the day with an early email or expectation of results. So I wonder, is there a way to be able to manage the overwhelm if you feel it's your manager and your boss or the organizational culture that causes the overwhelm?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 1,000 little tricks that people discovered. So one of my favorite, women in the interviews that we conducted was this very fiery young woman that said, I had this boss that was driving me crazy with, things that were kind of one-off things, one-off requests. He had no idea the amount of ask he was making. And I think this is the really big deal, right? Is that because of the collaborative intensity of the work, leaders make asks that look small. The actual task looks small, but because now we have to get buy-in and coordinate and resource and everything else from so many people, the collaborative footprint has grown, right? In ways that the leaders don't understand half the time what they're asking anymore. And so her, way to fight back on this, she said, one day he asked me something, it went over my top of my, to-do list. I couldn't, figure out how to get all this done. And so I just drew this impact to effort grid out, and said one axis was, what's the impact this thing is going to have? The other axis is, what's the effort? I think it came from Stephen Covey, but she was using it as a device to say, we're going to plot this thing out. And if it's, high effort, low impact, we're either going to not do it, or we're going to, figure out a different way to do it. Right. And she said the first time he did it, he was a little bit taken aback. But then after that, it became a device for them to manage the workload, right? Rather than just absorb it all, or worse yet, absorb it and turn it into your team and burn them out. And she said the most amazing thing happened was that, number one, they oftentimes figured out completely different ways to get the requirement done that wouldn't have been apparent if they hadn't had that conversation. And number two, what she found out later is that the boss knew he was going to face this silly impact to effort grid every time he asked something. So he stopped asking for things that weren't important. And
And that's really important, Rob, because we spend a lot of time in organizations on things that are not contributing to the priorities and the objectives. And as you said, the boss might think this is not going to take much time, it's just 5 minutes, while it takes a lot of time and takes focus away from those key priorities.
or your own well-being, right? You started off that question around why are people burning out? Well, a really big piece of it is the increased demands of work, but also that COVID has kind of taken us out of all these groups that kept us whole to begin with. The athletic groups, religious, poetry, book clubs, all sorts of things. And suddenly that gets sacrificed too, right, on the margin. But I'll tell you the other one that I see a lot of today that's become a really big deal. And again, it's these flattening structures. It's the problem with agile work is it looks good in terms of the teams and the way they're working as scrums, but it's, again, missing the collaborative overwhelm in different ways. So what we're seeing in the team level is what I call priority overload, where there are too many different asks coming from stakeholders who themselves aren't coordinating, right, coming into the teams. And again, people don't know what to do. There's no visibility into it. And so, I've heard great stories on this one where many people would just say, okay, I've got 5 stakeholders. They're bombarding me with requests. And they would either, pre-COVID, take them into a room where they had, stakeholder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and posted notes underneath. Okay, this is what you're asking me for. This is what you're asking me for. And then they would draw a line vertically or horizontally there and say, here's the capacity of my team. How do we solve this problem, right? Together. So and I've heard people do that virtually too, right? But they're just kind of putting the conversation back and saying, we need to kind of coordinate how we're getting this done. Versus just absorbing it. The absorbers are they're just going to implode at some point. You just can't do it anymore. There's too much stuff coming at people. But I think as we go, that's one of the areas that we've got to get really better at, is understanding these collaborative asks and the footprint of the asks. Because, people would never overspend their budget, right? We have great clarity on how much money I have to spend, but we will overspend our employees constantly because it's not transparent. We can't understand it as leaders, where all this collaborative time is going. And we've got to get better at applying some analytics to be able to help people just make better decisions, right? Nothing nefarious is going on. It's just this invisibility to it in a lot of ways.
That's an outstanding way of putting it, Rob. We don't overspend the budgets, but we are overtaxing the individuals in our teams and our organizations, which is contributing to a lot of stress, additional anxiety. Part of what's contributing to the turnover that organizations are facing and collaboration or ineffective collaboration is in part a contributor to it. The other thing that you mentioned, it aligns well with, I just had a conversation with Professor James Heskett of Harvard Business School. He also talks about this, uh, the same problems we're having with the supply chain because of the just-in-time approaches. Organizations having cut out so much of the middle management are having issues with collaboration and overstressing the systems.
Right. Right. And that's, for me at an individual level, when I talk to people about this, is we do the same thing to ourselves, and not just work, but home, right? We schedule it out, and everything can work if every last aspect of your life works perfectly. It could probably work, right? But that never happens, right? A child gets sick, or you run into a traffic jam on the way in when we were commuting. I mean, you name it. It's just these little things that that happen, or surges in work are going to naturally happen. People are going to shift expectations. And so it's one of the things that I talk to people a lot about, is finding ways to create, some buffer mechanism in your mind, at least, as you're planning things out and doing things. And I find that with the efficient collaborators, one of the things they're much more likely to do is strategically calendar Friday night or Sunday night with a 1-week time horizon, and typically about a 3-month time horizon. So they're kind of planning week to week, but then they're also planning, okay, this is where I want to go with my career. This is where I want to be in terms of the capabilities I want to use, the values I want to experience. And using, that approach with a 10-15% buffer in mind is a really smart thing, right? Because then you're absorbing any surge that happens, or if it doesn't happen, you've got time to invest, right? And do other things. We have far more control, I'm convinced of this, over what we do and when than we give ourselves. The people that get in trouble, they fall into the reactive posture, a little bit too much. And like you say, they become leaner and leaner until it just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, so it takes that planning, structure, and discipline. Now, you also mentioned, and you've studied networks for quite a while. You mentioned that when you do have that extra time, that extra capacity, networks are really important for the fast movers. What role do networks play?
Yeah, so great question. And the second half of the book for me was around thinking about, once we understand how people get this time back, really being cautious about understanding what they're doing that's enabling them to scale and kind of live life more on their terms, right? That has impact there. And so what we found is that high performers are never distinguished by a big network, ever statistically, only in things like residential real estate sales or very kind of transactional things, just purely the size of the network predict success. They are instead defined by a less insular network or more bridging ties into other pockets of the organization or other groups, such that they maintain a greater ability to innovate. Right? It's that bringing together of different ideas, different possibilities that really matter. My work's shown for 23, 24 years now. It's the second biggest predictor of a high performance. It's more structurally diverse network on many, many levels. But what I was interested in with the interviews is understanding, what does that mean? What do you tell busy people, right? Do you just go out and talk to people that are in different areas all the time, or what's going on? And what we learned in that, I would ask people to tell me about their career defining accomplishments, right? So just one, maybe two things they did that put them on this upwardly mobile path. And then not what they did, but what was the role of relationships, the connections that enabled them to see the possibility, scale their accomplishments, supplement skill gaps, kind of all these things that made that success happen and started an upward spiral. And what I learned in that was a couple of pretty important things. One is the more successful people, they tend to spend about 20 to 25% more time in exploration with others, right? So they're preserving time to reach out to others and say, how could we work together, right? Or tell me about your work and let me understand if there's a synergy here that we could deliver a greater financial transaction or consulting solution or something like that. So it's a form of networking where they're not going out and saying, gosh, I need your help, right? Or it's certainly not looking to tap an invisible power structure. It's exploration. And over time, they do that enough, they start to have a sense of how they could integrate other people when opportunities come along. And that's where the difference is, right? It's in these really small moments. Most people's career defining accomplishments, or if you track your own accomplishments back to this really inception point, usually it's a tiny moment, right? Where you see something pop up on LinkedIn and you lean into it, or you're about to walk out of a meeting or off a Zoom call and you say, wait, just one more minute, right? And that seeds the idea that then becomes something substantive. The people that have sowed relationships and begun to understand what capabilities are around me, how could I work with others, they see those opportunities differently, right? They don't see the consulting opportunity just on their expertise. They see it on how they could leverage others, and they win, right? Just because they're accomplishing things of bigger substance, and they're doing it in a way that's also building a network that over time starts to bring them opportunities. So it's at that level that I think it's really important to understand what those people are doing with the time. It's not they're buying time back and just adding more networking in. They're networking in a way that starts to create scale, right? And the ability to truly differentiate over time.
And I wonder, Rob, what has been the impact and what will be the impact of virtual and hybrid on cultivating these networks?
Yeah, most people are struggling because they're applying the same paradigm to building connections. So I was on with one of the investment banks early in this process, and they said, well, we have this whole new group from Dartmouth coming in. How are we going to get the Dartmouth people connected to the Dartmouth people? Because they would just use a football game or baseball game or whatever, right, over the summer to get people together. And so they're thinking about networking as, it's just a social activity to connect people that might like each other. And in fact, I was sitting there saying, well, how do you even know you want the Dartmouth people to talk to the Dartmouth people, right? What we know about the high performers is they build more diversity, right? And structured diversity into what they're doing. And so what we're finding in the consortia is the more that you're intentional about the kind of connection you're trying to form and the specific thing you're looking for from that relationship, you can craft experiences in a virtual context that are very effective at bringing people in. So, our work on transitions showed that there are 5 kinds of connections that people need early to build those relationships, and that increases the odds they stay longer, they're successful. Once you understand that, then you can give people a playbook and say, you as an incomer and you as your leader, here are the 5 kinds of ties. Help make some introductions, right? Help start these conversations. Use, pull versus push, right? Like we talked about early. And you actually find that there's pretty decent ability, even in virtual times, to pull people in. I'll give you another one that I hear constantly is the water cooler moment. Like any of us have been around a water cooler for 20 years, but we keep talking about this thing. And what you're obviously saying is serendipity, right? The serendipitous exchange that happens. So one of my favorite interviews, and this was with a gruff investment banker, and he ran a group of, I believe it was traders, and I believe it was like 40 of them or something like that. I won't get the number right, but he said, you got to imagine this kind of gruff accent. I won't try to mimic it, but he said, the pandemic hit and I was panicked. I couldn't see my people, right? I didn't know what was going on. And I was worried about, innovation faltering, people knowing what each other was doing. And he said his wife convinced him to do this thing that he called the Friday Rose. So he on a Friday afternoon, just as he was about to turn off the computer, he sent an email out to this group of, I think it was 40, and said, okay, here's, my STEM for this week. And it's kind of what I learned, how I grew through this week. Here's the bud or the flower. Here's the cool thing that happened to me. And then here's a thorn, right? Here's the thing I messed up or I wish I'd done differently, right? And, to hear him tell the story was really funny. He said, I hit the send button and I could feel people laughing at me. What is this guy doing? And he got a couple of different jabs back and he said, no, you guys have got to do it too now. And so over the course of maybe an hour, everybody's responding off of this email with their own, growth opportunity, cool thing, thorn. And he said within a couple of weeks, as this norm got down, he saw more serendipitous opportunities emerge than he ever saw when they were face to face, right? It was just a structured way of introducing possibilities of serendipity because people would say, oh, you're doing this, I'm doing this, right? That wasn't transparent before. And he said that, having that thorn in there, here's the thing I messed up. He felt bred a level of authenticity that had never existed in the group. People being willing to kind of say, here's things that aren't going well and get help. And so I think that's the real key, right? It's not looking at collaboration in a virtual context and saying, we need a Zoom call, right? Because that's driving by the tool, right? It's rather stepping back and saying, I need to promote serendipity, or I need to promote trust, right? Or things that you're really intentional about, curating the experience. And it'll never be as good as face-to-face. I mean, I think there's always something there, but it can be a heck of a lot better than if we're just throwing the same tools right at the problem as we go, I think.
What a great way for the leader in that case, serving as an example in making that serendipity happen. One of the challenges I found, Rob, is a lot of people are trying to duplicate the in-person experience on Zoom. So I know you also had a conversation with Aaron Hurst where I first connected with you. Aaron makes fun of the water cooler conversations, and I agree with him in that some companies have been doing Zoom water cooler conversations that are extremely awkward,
Yeah, exactly.
forgetting what is the purpose, what do you want to accomplish? And if you want serendipity, there are other ways to approach it. And this is a great way of approaching that serendipity. Now, how else can leaders help networks within their teams and organization connect more effectively?
One of the things that I hear a lot about, and it's become a big deal for me in this next book, is just the issues around well-being. So let me kind of grab that one for a second and how people are doing today. And it's put a burden on leaders. Every company's out there giving some kind of toolkit or tool set to say, talk with your people about this, or give more time off, or be more kind of clear in policies and things that they can fall back on. One of the things that we spend a lot of time on, in part with this book and in part with the next one, is understanding kind of the relational drivers of well-being. So what is it that creates a happier person? Where I don't mean happy kind of giddy in the moment, but just these people that are saying life's going pretty well, right? Over time, right? I'm in a good place. And the thing that we saw in that, we can see very clearly how connections play a role in terms of when people decide to make an effort to improve their physical health and they persist, right? There's generally, it's not an informational problem, or you wouldn't see New Year's Eve resolutions fall away by January 23rd, right? You wouldn't know what they need to do, but it's putting that activity in a set of connections and certain things around it that tend to create the persistence, as an example. So we learned a lot about kind of ways that connections impact health, resilience, purpose, and growth, right? That leaders can kind of stimulate to create, a context that people want to be a part of. But the biggest thing that surprised me was the degree of stress that people were under. And so I was on the very first interview in this work, and it was a very successful life sciences executive in London. And she was telling me the story. She said, Rob, I was the person in high school that dodged gym every chance I could, right? I wanted nothing to do with physical activity. And she said, I hit my late 30s, where this typically happens for people. You know, you're absorbed in work, family responsibilities take off, you've fallen out of groups that kept you whole to begin with. And she said, you know, my doctor said, I've got to do something about this. I had a stern warning from the doctor. So she started walking around this park in London, and outside of her flat or something, you know, like that was convenient. And she began to bump into a couple of people that were doing the same thing. So she started walking with them, and that emerged into, you know, doing a charity walk, and then they started running, and then that ran into a charity run. And you flash forward 10 years to when I was interviewing her, and she was describing how at this point in her life, she was going on vacations with her husband, where they would pick a spot where they would do a marathon first and then the vacation, right? And this was the person that dodged gym, right? And what she said is it had nothing to do with the activity. I mean, being a runner gave her a sense of identity that pushed back on work, but it was really the authenticity of the relationships of the people involved, and the fact that they were coming at life from very different places that kept perspective for her, right? That was really critical. So, you know, it was like the best interview ever. I'm thinking, if I get another 299 of these, I could be happy beyond belief. But then I stopped and I said, well, what got you to this point to begin with? Like, where you had to take such, you know, action? And she just paused, and it was like dead silence for 30, 45 seconds. And then she finally just said, just life, I guess, you know, couldn't quite even put her finger on it. And that really led me to dig into that. And it has led me to this idea of what I'm calling micro stresses, that I think are ways I was alluding to earlier. Stress comes at us every day through these small touch points. So professionally, we sense a colleague that's misaligned with what we need to do, and you're worried about how are you going to rectify that. Or you see a team member that needs to be coached for the third time, right? And you're worried about how do I keep engagement. Or you get, you know, a note from an aging parent, right, that you can't tell, you know, what are you going to do to solve that problem. And the issue today is that we're hit with 20, 25, 30 of these as we go through the day. None of them are insurmountable on their own, but we go home exhausted, and we can't even anymore really say why or what's happening. And so, you know, one of the things that I think leaders have to get better at is when we're looking at well-being or pieces like that, there's a whole body that is focused around mindfulness, meditation, those elements is absolutely important. But at the heart of it, they only allow you to persist, right, in the context that you've built. And what I'm finding with the people that are doing better is they're better able to kind of lean into the positive sides, the things that promote health, but they're also really good at understanding where are these micro stresses coming from, and how do I shift my context in a way that I can, you know, better thrive today. So I think that's, to me, one of the biggest things that organizations and leaders have got to pay attention to create a context that's going to kind of keep people engaged, especially in light of the resignations, right, that everybody is predicting and worried about right now.
It is definitely a big stressor in people's lives, and that well-being is really important. So I'm glad both you cover it in Beyond Collaboration Overload, and you are doing more work for your next book on it. So I wonder, with that said, Rob, you have a lot of demands on your time, both with respect to collaboration and tapping into networks that can be positive for you, and you need to maintain your well-being. What do you do for your own well-being?
Yeah. So I'll say one of the things I had to learn to guard against is, you know, we were talking about the servant-based mindset leader earlier. For me, the overload, when I talk about these triggers, it's driven by a need for accomplishment. Like, if I see a 5-minute window, I'll try to jam 60 minutes of stuff into it. And I'll completely ignore the 2 to 3 hours of coordination I have to do to get other people engaged with me, and then be grumbling 6 weeks later because this thing is way more work than it should be. And I completely lose sight of the fact that I started it to begin with. You know, saw this thing, well-intended, should be done, could be done, but I just ignore the collaborative footprint, and it kills me right over time. And so I've had to and I study this all the time, right? I think about this all the time. I still do it. And I had to kind of make a deal with my wife that I would not take on anything until I talked to her first, so that there's guardrail on me. But I think like the chapter that's on those beliefs and these triggers that lead us to jump in, like that's a really important piece for us all. Is it accomplishment, status, fear, influence? All of us have one or more of these things that drive us into unproductive tendencies that I think is critical. But then for me, I think it's putting the structure in. So I've gotten to be an avid cyclist. I bike about 150 miles a week with a similar, bunch of old guys that are way out of shape and trying to convince themselves that they're, better. But it's the same thing as the marathon runner, right? It's the authenticity of those relationships. It's that I'm spending time with a mailman, an IT executive, people that see life differently, and it creates a dimension. If I had one thought for your listeners is, people need at least two and usually three groups like that, whether it's physical, religious, old friends, book clubs, whatever. It's those things that create dimensionality in our lives and let us rise above some of these micro stresses, right? We're going to get hit with so many of them, no matter what, that we can only deal with some of them directly. Another way we have to learn to deal with it is by rising above it a little bit. And of course, again, that's what I was referencing earlier. That's what COVID has hurt us on. It's pulled us out of all those groups. We're used to thinking about the stress just as the volume of demands that are on us, but it's also our coping mechanisms that have kind of gone away too. So that's one thing I do. There's a couple of other dimensions of it, but I won't bore everybody.
No, I think that's a really important point, Rob, in that there are a lot of things that leaders and organizations can do differently. However, a lot of it, with respect to this collaboration overload or advancing the networks and maintaining our wellness, rests on our shoulders. And what you just mentioned is an important element outside of work that we need to prioritize in order to maintain our wellness. So it's not pointing fingers at others and what they need to do. It's tapping into these opportunities totally outside of work. This is not something that can be initiated even if we work in the healthiest environment possible.
Right. And in some cases, even, some of these places I interviewed in, they were like, greatest place to work, right? Very wonderful places. But those places, if they become all absorbing and they take you away from other things that create a little bit of dimensionality, it can be just as bad, and it happens. Like I had Wall Street banks, obviously, in my sample, and they're tough because everything's about money, right? There's not a tremendous amount of purpose in what they do. And you kind of expect that. You see it, right? They're living life in a way that they justify by taking care of their family. What surprised me is you see the same problem in the high-end hospitals, for example, right? Where the physicians it's entirely about work and family. At least they have a little bit more purpose, right, in what they're doing. They're advancing science, or they're impacting clinicians, but they struggle in the same way, right? Is without that dimensionality in your life, then things take on much greater significance, right? The vagaries of work. And again, one of my favorite interviewees in that line was a neuroscientist, top hospital in the country, very well respected in what he did. And as he went through COVID, he started playing guitar again, which he'd done in high school. And he was describing it to me with this huge grin on his face. He said, I'm hanging out with 20-year-olds again. And it's just giving me a whole new purchase on life. And this is somebody that's, one of the most well-regarded scientists out there. But it's that dimensionality, right, that's really critical to preserve. And it plays back into work too, right? It's not just that it's making you somebody different outside of work, but you show up more present in work. People can connect with you on different levels. And you're somebody others want to engage with, because of that aspect of your life too.
And it is one of those things that we need to prioritize, as you mentioned, because of COVID and a lot of those factors. Many of us have cut it out of our lives, and that has by itself caused more anxiety and stress. Now, there's so much great content and information in your book. As I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, Rob, I recommend it on a daily basis because I think it's really important for us to know how to collaborate better. And I have to tell you, the chapter where you talk about the triggers was the hardest one for me. and the most important one, in that we each have some of those triggers, whether it's achievement or others, that pull us into that overload and feeling overwhelmed, both adding to our anxiety and stress, and in many instances, reducing our productivity. So, in addition to your great book, are there other resources that you typically find yourself recommending, or leadership practices that you find yourself recommending for people as they want to lead more effectively and be better at their collaboration and maintaining wellness in their lives?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I won't name specific books, but it's becoming more aware of internal triggers, especially that manifest in how you interact with others. You know what I mean? And so I think that to me is the biggest thing for people to be successful today, is to kind of reflect on their own personal tendencies. Some of the books that I'm obviously love right now are around understanding the relational roles of connections and happiness or longevity. Like the Harvard longevity studies are showing that and really every book out there, Stu Friedman's work, I think, is fantastic on this front, that all talk about the importance of relationships in leading kind of a life that's seen as meaningful or just living longer. And so those are kind of the resources I would be kind of leaning back into. And there's a ton of them. Not one comes to mind, but just different studies along that front.
Yeah, it is really important. And Dan Buettner had also looked at the blue zones for
Right.
longevity.
Right.
That's really important. And one of the unfortunate parts is that not just because of COVID, but even pre social media over the past 30 years, most specifically in the US, we have fewer of those deep connections to individuals. So that is really impacting our mental well being.
And when I was doing the well-being work, one of the things I would ask about in these interviews was to tell me about a stretch in life that was difficult for you, right? So maybe sometimes it was a catastrophic thing, but sometimes it was I didn't get a promotion, right? Or and then I would ask people, well, who did you talk to, right? How did you rely on others to get through this? And what we learned through that is that people fall back on others in pretty predictable ways when they need resilience, right? So you turn to people for empathy or to see a perspective in the situation that isn't as bad as you think, or to see a path forward, or just to laugh at the absurdity, of where you are. And the people that have those connections, right, they're going to weather adversity much better, right, if they have that to fall back on than people that don't. Interestingly enough, to me too, is just being aware of what you need. And this is a little bit of what I meant in terms of understanding your desires. So some people, need empathy and that's it. Other people need empathy and then a path forward. Some people just like to laugh at the absurdity. But the more attuned you are to that, the better able you're to fall back on those relationships in productive ways.
And that's why I really look forward to also reading your next book. But before we get to that, for the audience to find out more about your book, resources, connection, where can they go to, Rob?
First place for me would be robcross.org. We put a lot of resources out there that I generate from the consortia, but also even just summary videos on the book or things that just help people consume the ideas if they don't want to go into a kind of a full book level discourse on it. Second place I would strongly recommend is the group that I run called the Connected Commons, and that's a consortia. It's going to about 150 organizations that helps shape and create access for these analytical findings like the book and other things. But that's a really wonderful community just to hear about what others are doing with these ideas, how they're putting them into play in different ways. So those would be the two things that come to mind.
And it is incredible how many videos and great articles and resources you have on the two sites. So I would strongly recommend for people to read the book and most specifically reflect on it, because I think it's important for our own well being as well as for the organization's well being. And I want to end with a quote. From you, Rob. You said a collaboration overload feels great until it doesn't. You feel you're in the middle of things, being productive until it's total overwhelm. We can all be busy, but are you busy in a way that is getting you closer to who you want to be. Thank you so much, Rob Cross, for the book, for the work, and for the conversation on partnering leadership.
Thank you. It's such a privilege to be here.